The princess chose a human as her champion. The galaxy gasped. Species that spoke in colors stood beside beings that shaped thought into music. Flags hung from levels and balconies, 1,000 emblems woven together into a single strange tapestry. People came from planets with seas the color of mercury, and from worlds where the ground hummed underfoot. Everyone came to watch the Rite of Champions. Princess Solaris walked in a long, spare dress that moved like water. She did not look like someone who would shock a galaxy. She walked with a slow, steady step, and her face was calm. Behind her, a line of candidates waited, warriors and diplomats, strong arms and quiet intellects. They were all magnificent in ways that had been polished for generations. They had been selected because their people thought them the best. The conquered expected a grand choice. It expected tradition. Elia's ward sat near the back. He still felt like he did not belong. He was one of the new delegates from Earth, a small blue planet far from the center of power. Earth had joined the conquered only a few cycles before, and the planet's name was often said in polite curiosity. Humans were clever, the reports said. They were stubborn and full of ideas. They had made leaps in a short time. But to most in the hall, humans were young and unpredictable. Elias had arrived in a borrowed suit, his face carrying the tired lines of someone who had slept poorly. He had served on a survey ship. He had spent nights learning the alien protocols. He had learned to keep his hands open and still, to smile when others smiled, to be a careful shape in groups that were older and larger than his people's stories. When Princess Solaris climbed the dais, the ancient bell of the conquered rang. It was a sound felt in the chest more than heard. The hall hushed. Eyes that had seen thousands of years of politics turned to the princess. Cameras hovered like small moons, capturing every angle. The Rite of Champions began. The law of old worlds required the princess to publicly choose a protector, someone to stand with her in time of danger or trial. The choice was not just personal, it was political. It set alliances. It sent messages. Every noble in the hall leaned forward when she reached the line of candidates. They expected the traditional pick, the hulking sentinel from the planet Ordra, perhaps, or the telepathic envoy born on the ice moons. Instead, Solaris paused when she came to Elias. She did not look at his uniform. She did not glance at his insignia or the quiet badge that marked him as an Earth delegate. She looked at his hands, which were not smooth or delicate. She looked at the small scar on his knuckle and at the way his eyes held a nervous brightness. Elias felt his heart jump. He had not expected that anyone would notice him. He had spent months teaching himself to be invisible in crowds. For a moment, he thought the princess would walk on. Her fingers brushed something on the ribbon that hung across her chest, and then she stepped forward. The hall leaned closer. "I choose Elia's ward," she said. The sound of her voice filled the hall but did not shake her calm. The conquered did not follow with the usual applause. For a few seconds nothing happened. Then a ripple of noise rose like wind in the trees. The reaction started small, a rustle, a low hiss, a single sharp intake of breath. The press cameras zoomed in. Across the galleries, delegates turned toward one another with eyes wide. A burly figure in plated armor let out an involuntary laugh that sounded like old iron. Someone smuggled a comment into the public feed, an old voice scolding the new blood. Elias felt all of those noises like a pressure. He felt like a small animal beneath great giants. He heard whispers that accused, that mocked. Why him? Is the princess ill? Some joke. He wished he could sink into the stone floor and be gone. He told himself to stand still and to breathe. He had learned to breathe in the last months. He had learned to walk where nothing else in the room felt like home. Solaris did not wait for the uproar to settle. She lifted her hand and the bell chimed again, a softer echo. "This is not a whim," she said. "I will not be represented by a body chosen to please old fears. I choose a champion who reminds me what we are when we have not been shaped entirely by our history." The words landed like a cool rain. Not everyone understood them. Some heard a challenge, others heard a plea. In the galleries, a group of senators from the high houses exchanged looks that meant calculation. Political winds shifted a little, the kind that carry silent lists of favors and debts. Solaris had spoken a truth that did not fit neatly into the old ledger. That frightened things. Elias tried to speak but found his voice thin and small. He had never been chosen for a role like this, and the suddenness of it felt like a tide. A steward stepped forward to place the chain of office on his shoulders. It was a thing made of a metal he did not recognize, warm even in the air-conditioned hall. The chain hummed faintly, and people who were very old lowered their hands to touch it like a relic. Elias felt the weight more as a promise than as a burden. Across the upper balconies, cameras fired. The feeds filled with a single image, a human with a worn suit and a knuckle scar wearing the princess's chain. Messages flickered through the public lines. Some were incredulous. Some were cruel. A small wave of satire bloomed. The oldest houses sent delegations with faces that were the practiced stillness of storms. Solaris walked down the dais and stood beside Elias. For the first time, he saw a private look on her face. It was not triumph or defiance. It was something like hope. In the months before the rite, she had been seen consulting scholars and listening to poets, but no one had known that she had spent evenings reading histories of the human home world. She had watched videos from Earth with pale light in her eyes. She had read about human struggles and their small, stubborn joys. Where others saw noise, she saw a pattern that made a certain kind of sense. "You will be tested," she said softly so only he could hear. "You will be watched. There will be those who try to break you. Remember who you are." Her voice held no pity. There was an edge of quiet belief that made Elias want to stand straighter. When the formalities ended, the crowd did not simply disperse. The Concord's public records opened an immediate archive. Pundits spoke through virtual feeds. Some analysts made long lists of reasons why Solaris's choice would be political suicide. Others called it a necessary shock to a culture grown complacent. On dozens of worlds, people leaned in to see what would happen. The news cycles of 1,000 systems filled with commentators drawing old maps, who stood with whom, who might shift, who hoped to use the incident to move a piece in some old game. Elias did not sleep much that night. He sat in a small room that had been provided to him and read a message from his sister that arrived on a personal line. Her words were 2 sentences carried across a light year and several layers of protocol. "We saw you," she wrote. "You did a strange thing and made us all feel bigger. Don't forget to eat." He laughed to himself, a soft sound. He did not know how to answer the whispering storms of the Concord. He knew only the small map of his life. The ship's mess, the press of crowded stations, the smell of recycled air, the way a joke could turn a long watch into a shared life. He had learned to fix engines with a hand that shook sometimes. He had learned to keep steady in storms because his crew depended on him. None of those things were grand. Yet when Solaris had looked at him, he had not seen the smallness others had described. He had felt strangely seen. The next day, the Concord published the schedule of trials. The Rite of Champions had old rituals, tests that measured strength, cunning, and will. The trials would be held in a controlled arena orbiting an old moon where environments could be changed like pages in a book. Each champion would face challenges meant to test their capacity to protect and to lead under pressure. For decades, those trials had rewarded raw power and trained reflexes. In the public debates, the first comments predicted failure. Betting pools opened on hundreds of worlds. Some wagers were petty. Who would be eliminated first? Others were barbed with politics. Would a human become a rallying cry for revolution, or a cautionary tale used to silence new voices? Elias walked through the market of the Concord, seeing the eyes that followed him. He noticed small things: a child who did not hide when he passed, a merchant who smiled and slipped him a strange fruit. Not everyone reacted with scorn. A thin man from the planet Vesh stopped Elias to ask about Earth's weather. He had read a poem from Earth and wanted to know whether it was true that the rain there sounded like 1,000 small hands. Elias described rain in simple words. The man laughed and gave him a seed that would sprout into a plant that crept like thin fingers. In that tiny exchange, Elias found a kind of fellowship that nothing in the political halls could take away. Not all encounters were kind. A high delegate from the Iron Clans refused to acknowledge him. She passed with a thin smile that felt like a blade. A news anchor asked him seemingly polite questions, and then framed those answers into a line that painted him as a novelty. Critics said the princess had been naive. Others accused her of staging a spectacle. The hull of the Conquered carried those criticisms like small stones. When Elias read them, he felt the same ache he had felt as a young boy when classmates had laughed at his hands when they got grease on them. He remembered then that dying to remember who you are is not an option. You keep living. The first test was announced in the morning, an exercise in navigation through a shifting landscape. The arena would change. The champions would have to find safe ground for the princess under conditions that bent the usual rules. For many delegates, the test seemed a simple favor to give the favored. For others, it would reveal something fundamental. Celaris's selection had already become a lesson the Conquered could not ignore. Elias practiced that day. He ran with a group of trainees who laughed at his unfamiliar steps, and then fell silent when he saved one of them from slipping on a simulated ridge. He trained in the quiet hours at dawn and in the noisy partial darkness of night. He practiced not because he believed he would win, but because he did not know how to do anything else. His method was small and human. Check the ropes twice, tie a knot that would not fail, listen to the pattern of the wind. On the evening before the trials began, Celaris visited him in the training halls. She found him repairing a harness that had been frayed by use. He was not an impressive figure in the training room. He had no flash or the flash of a practiced champion. He had hands that could mend things. "You might surprise them," she said, watching him work. He looked up at her, and for the first time without the hall between them, he saw a memory in her face. She remembered being a child looked at with expectations she did not want and learning to say no softly. He realized she had chosen him intentionally to show the Conquered a different way of being. She had chosen the human to remind them that the future might not be a repeat of the past. He did not know if he could be what the princess believed. He had doubts that visited him like bad weather. But there was something else, too, a steady light that warmed the edges of his thought. If he failed, it would matter to people who trusted him because he wore the chain of a princess. If he succeeded, it would change a map of alliances and stories. Either way, he could only do what he knew, keep moving forward, help those near him, and use his hands. When he went asleep that night, the city hummed with comments. The universe was full of voices asserting how the story would unfold. In the dark, Elias thought of his sister's message and of the seed the Vesh man had given him. He thought of small things, a cup of warm tea, the exact angle of a knot, the sound of someone laughing with you at something small and private. He did not dream of triumph. He dreamed of a rain that sounded like 1,000 small hands, and he woke with a curiosity that felt like armor. The morning of the first test arrived bright and indifferent. Cameras hovered. The press hummed. Delegates clustered in their places and waited for the first move. Elias stood beside Princess Celaris on the platform. Around them, the Conquered watched with 100 plans and 100 fears. Elias had never seen anything like the training halls of the Conquered. The arena, floating above the cratered moon, stretched in every direction, a network of shifting terrain designed to test champions. Platforms rose and fell, and walls changed shape, sometimes sliding out of the way, sometimes appearing where there had been nothing. The air carried a faint hum, the sound of machinery that bent gravity, light, and sound to the will of its creators. Aliens from dozens of species moved through the space, each displaying a skill honed over centuries. Some leaped without effort across floating ledges. Others manipulated energy fields with gestures as precise as poetry. Elias, in a simple human jumpsuit, felt small. The first day began with basic exercises. Champions were asked to move through an obstacle course while carrying a small, delicate object meant to represent the princess's safety. The task was simple in words but complicated in execution. The platforms shifted without warning, gravity changed unexpectedly, and false paths opened to trick the champions. Many of the older species handled it with ease. They moved like living shadows, anticipating the changes before they happened. Elias stumbled. He tripped over an unexpected rise in the floor, catching himself at the last moment. His first thought was panic, then frustration. He noticed the object in his hands, a small, polished cube, and realized it did not break in his grip. Humans were not the strongest or the fastest, but they were careful, adaptable, and observant. He began to move more slowly, watching patterns rather than rushing, feeling the subtle changes in the floor beneath his boots. The other champions noticed him. Some sneered openly. A tall, armored figure from the world of Ordra shook his head and whispered in the translator feed, "A human. The princess will regret this." Elias heard it faintly, but he did not look back. Princess Celaris observed from a nearby platform. Her eyes were steady. She did not intervene, but she did not need to. She had chosen him because she had seen something the galaxy did not yet understand. She believed in his ability to find solutions where others relied on raw power. The human instinct to adapt, to think beyond instinct and training, was a kind of strength the galaxy had not measured. By midday, the first real test began. The champions were led to a room that appeared empty at first, but walls shifted to create a maze of corridors and moving platforms. A low voice from the speakers explained the challenge. Each champion must navigate the maze and reach a platform in the center. The twist was that the platform moved, and each step required calculation. Misstep, and they would fall into the lower levels, which were not dangerous physically, but would cost time and points. Most champions started with leaps and bounds, moving as though the maze itself were a natural extension of their bodies. Elias hesitated at first. He observed the movement of the walls, the rise and fall of platforms, the patterns in the shifting light. He walked carefully, timing each step. At times he jumped, at others he waited, letting the maze come to him. Slowly, methodically, he progressed. When he passed a particularly tricky section, another champion, a tall, four-armed creature from the planet Vakar, collapsed in frustration beside him. Elias helped the Vakar up, steadying him without thought. The other champion gave him a look of surprise. On most worlds, showing assistance could be seen as weakness. Humans often acted differently. It was instinctive for Elias to help, not because he sought reward, but because it was right. By the end of the day, Elias had not come first. He had not even come close to the fastest champions, but he had completed the course without serious mistakes. Some of the other species had been eliminated, tripped by their own overconfidence or inability to adapt. News feeds across the Concord reported his performance with mixed commentary. Some commentators mocked him, others highlighted his unique approach. Already, humans were beginning to be talked about as unpredictable, potentially dangerous. The evening brought the second trial, more complex than the first. This one tested problem-solving under stress. Each champion was placed in a small floating chamber, separated from the others. They faced a sequence of puzzles designed to simulate crises. A simulated fire on the princess's platform, a breach in the chamber's hull, and threats that required immediate response. The solutions required speed, creativity, and teamwork when allowed. Many of the alien champions had been trained to respond to patterns, but the puzzles included elements meant to confuse predictable thinking. Elias approached the first puzzle cautiously. The room began to shake, alarms blaring. He noticed the pattern of lights and shadows, the way the panels responded to movement. He worked methodically, moving a lever, pressing buttons, and adjusting panels in a sequence that made sense to him. Others panicked. Many pressed the wrong buttons in haste. The room seemed to mock the champions who relied solely on instinct and muscle. He reached the final panel just as the chamber dimmed, indicating the puzzle was complete. He had finished faster than expected, not because he had reacted quickly, but because he had observed carefully. The princess, watching from the central gallery, gave a faint nod. It was not praise, it was acknowledgement. The third day brought the most visible challenge, the obstacle course designed for public viewing. A section of the arena open to allow spectators and cameras. The challenge involved balancing across moving platforms over a shallow pit filled with bright, shifting energy fields. Each champion had to carry a heavy object, symbolic of the princess's safety, to a designated platform at the center. The weight of the object combined with the instability of the platforms created a test of both strength and precision. Elia's first step onto the platform made him wobble. He adjusted his stance, feeling the subtle vibrations through his boots. The Vakar champion had already leaped ahead, gliding with natural balance. Elias watched, then noticed a pattern. The platforms rotated on a predictable rhythm. He did not try to match the Vakar's leaps. Instead, he timed each step with precision. He moved deliberately, taking a path that the faster champions overlooked. When a section tilted unexpectedly, he held onto the support rails, then pushed off to regain balance. Some of the alien spectators laughed at the human's methodical pace. Others leaned forward, intrigued. By the time he reached the center platform, several faster champions had slipped, faltered, or required assistance from their handlers. Elias placed the heavy object down carefully, then raised his hand in acknowledgement. The crowd murmured. It was not victory in the traditional sense, but it was enough to earn attention. In the quiet moments after the course, Elias walked through the corridors behind the arena. He felt exhausted, but something stronger than fatigue grew within him. He had moved in ways the galaxy had not expected. He had survived, not by defeating others directly, but by thinking differently. The other champions looked at him with new respect, though some still harbored resentment. A few whispered, "Perhaps humans are cleverer than we believed." That night, the princess visited him in the quiet training quarters. Elias was cleaning his equipment, checking straps, and oiling the small mechanisms that kept his suit in working order. Solaris observed him without comment for a long moment. "You are not the strongest," she said finally, "nor are you the fastest, but you see things differently. You do not follow the rules blindly, and you do not fear to act when others hesitate. That is why I chose you." Elias felt a warmth he had not known in such crowded halls. "I am trying to learn," he said quietly. "I do not know if I can do what is expected." "That is the point," Solaris said. "Most of the galaxy expects you to fail. You will surprise them if you stay true to your way. And your way is human, it is stubborn, it is careful, it is thoughtful." Elias nodded. He realized that her belief in him mattered more than the opinions of the hundreds of alien eyes that watched. He could not control their judgment, but he could control his actions. The following morning, the fourth day, brought the first test in teamwork. Champions were paired in groups to solve challenges together. They had to retrieve objects scattered across the arena while avoiding hazards. Humans had no physical advantage over the stronger species, and at first, his partner, a tall, winged creature from the planet Althera, looked at him as if he were a nuisance. The Althera champion could glide across gaps easily and lift heavy objects with little effort. Elias observed, learning his partner's patterns. He suggested routes that minimized risk, even when it meant moving slower. At first, the Althera looked skeptical, But as the day progressed, it became clear that Elia's careful planning prevented mistakes. By the end of the trial, their group finished with minimal errors, while others faltered due to overconfidence or lack of coordination. News feeds exploded. Humans were being described as unpredictable yet effective. Analysts debated whether this was luck or strategy. The princess's choice had already forced the galaxy to reconsider assumptions. Elias knew that he had not yet won any trials, but he had survived and proven a point. He had survived not because he matched the older species in strength or speed, but because he had used observation, patience, and human ingenuity. The evening of the fourth day brought a quiet moment. Elias walked through a narrow corridor overlooking the arena. The lights of the shifting platforms below glimmered like distant stars. He felt the weight of the challenges to come. The final trial was yet to begin. It would test courage, intelligence, and loyalty in ways the previous days had only hinted at. He did not know what it would entail, only that it would be difficult, and that failure could mean disgrace for both him and the princess. Still, he felt a new confidence. He had begun to understand the value of his own perspective, the way humans approached problems differently than the older species. He had begun to see that what was often considered weakness could be strength when applied thoughtfully. Princess Celaris appeared beside him once more. "Tomorrow," she said, "you face the greatest test yet. Remember, it is not the strongest who wins, but the one who can endure and adapt. Trust yourself." Elias nodded. He felt the gravity of her words, and a spark of determination lit inside him. The galaxy watched, waiting to see if the human would falter. But Elias had learned something the galaxy had not yet noticed. Humans were not defined by muscle or size. They were defined by resilience, creativity, and the will to keep moving forward when everything seemed against them. The first part of the trials had been survived. The second part loomed, more dangerous and more complex. Champions would be tested like never before. But Elias was no longer just a human in a strange hall of powerful species. He was the princess's champion, a living symbol that the galaxy had misjudged. And he would meet the next challenge on his own terms, step by careful step, hands steady, eyes watching, mind thinking. The galaxy would learn, one trial at a time, that humans were not easily understood, and perhaps not easily defeated. The sun, or what passed for a sun in the floating arena, rose slowly over the shifting platforms. Its light was cold and white, bouncing off walls that seemed to stretch into infinity. Champions from dozens of worlds gathered at the central platform, their expressions serious. The first two trials had filtered the contenders, but the third trial promised a test that went beyond speed, strength, or cleverness. This trial was about survival, observation, and endurance. The announcement came with a calm, impersonal voice from the overhead speakers, explaining the challenge. Champions would enter a simulated environment resembling a wild planet. There, they would face a series of hazards, and the winner would be the one who protected the object, symbolizing the princess's safety while completing the course. Elias looked around him. The other champions were impressive, all bearing the marks of centuries of selective training. The Vakar warrior stretched his four arms, flexing muscles that gleamed under the light. The Althara champion flexed her wings, testing their span. Elias adjusted the straps on his harness and examined the small survival pack on his back. It was light, simple, and human. He felt the weight of expectation, of countless eyes watching from distant planets, and of the princess's calm confidence. The first part of the trial required crossing a jagged landscape of rocks, pools of shallow acid, and sudden drops. Each champion had to retrieve several small items scattered across the area and bring them back to a central point. Most competitors leapt without hesitation, relying on speed and raw power to overcome the terrain. Elias studied the rocks and the layout carefully. He noticed patterns in how the light reflected, how shadows moved with the shifting platforms. Step by step, he moved cautiously, testing the surface before committing his weight. A sudden tremor rocked the arena. Rocks shifted, and one of the heavier champions, an armored figure from the planet Ordra, slipped, falling into a shallow pool of simulated acid. The pain was harmless, part of the design, but it cost him time. Elias paused for a moment, then extended a hand. The Ordra reached out reluctantly. Elias pulled him up, steadying him on the solid ground. The Ordra gave him a look of surprise, then moved ahead without a word. It was a small gesture, but it made an impression on the watchers, both in the arena and on feeds transmitted to the wider galaxy. By midday, Elias had learned to move with a rhythm that the other champions did not anticipate. They assumed humans would rush or fail, but his careful steps allowed him to avoid unnecessary mistakes. He retrieved each item with precision, carefully securing them in his pack. Other champions struggled, slipping on rocks or miscalculating jumps. Some grew frustrated and began to argue among themselves. The arena tested not only their physical abilities, but also their composure under stress. The second section of the trial introduced environmental hazards designed to challenge intelligence and creativity. Holographic walls rose suddenly, creating narrow passageways. Wind gusts, invisible at first, pushed with varying intensity. The path ahead required careful observation and quick adaptation. The other champions faltered, reacting too quickly, while Elias slowed, observing patterns. He noticed that the gusts of wind followed a rhythm, allowing him to time his movements. Where others rushed and stumbled, he advanced steadily. One of the smaller champions, a lithe creature from the planet Zephyra, became trapped between two shifting walls. Panic set in, and the Zephyra's usual grace disappeared. Elias reached the Zephyra just in time, guiding the creature through the narrowing gap. The Zephyra whispered thanks, astonished at the human's calm. The princess, watching from above, allowed herself a faint smile. Elias had not sought recognition, but his actions displayed the kind of judgment and empathy that the trials were designed to measure but rarely found in the faster, stronger species. The third section was the most challenging. A vast field of unstable platforms floating over a pit filled with simulated lava. The platforms shifted unpredictably, rising and falling without warning. The champions had to cross while carrying a heavy object, symbolic of the princess's safety. Many of the larger champions attempted to leap from one platform to another with force, only to misjudge the distance and fall. Elias observed the patterns in the platform's movement, timing his steps with careful precision. He moved slowly but deliberately, maintaining balance. His pack of items shifted with him, but he managed to keep them secure. A sudden surge in the platform's motion caused the Althera champion to lose her footing. She would have fallen into the pit if not for Elias' quick reflexes. Without hesitation, he reached out, stabilizing her with one hand while keeping his own balance. The other champions watched in astonishment. It was not a display of strength, but of timing, adaptability, and courage. The human had become an anchor in a chaotic environment, an example of the kind of ingenuity the galaxy had not anticipated. By the end of the day, Elias had completed the course without a single mistake. Other champions, though faster and stronger, had stumbled multiple times. News feeds across the Concord buzzed with commentary. Analysts debated whether this was luck or skill, some insisting the human could not sustain such performance, while others pointed out that his methods revealed a new kind of strength, resilience and adaptability over raw power. The evening brought a quiet reflection. Elias found a small corner of the arena to sit, resting his back against a wall. He thought of the princess, of the faith she had placed in him, and of the many worlds that had doubted humans. He realized that the trial was teaching him something beyond survival. It was teaching him to trust his own instincts, to value observation and careful action over brute force. It was teaching him that being human, thoughtful, persistent, empathetic, could be a kind of power in itself. The next morning introduced the fourth section of the trial, teamwork under pressure. Champions were paired into small groups and assigned tasks that required coordination and problem-solving. Elias was partnered with the Zephyra and a large Vakar warrior. Initially, the pairing seemed unstable. The Vakar relied on strength, the Zephyra on agility, and Elias on careful planning. They began with a simple task: move a heavy object through a series of obstacles while avoiding hazards. The Vakar insisted on lifting and carrying the object directly. The Zephyra wanted to use agility to skip obstacles. Elias observed both approaches and suggested an alternative: distribute the weight, use leverage, and coordinate timing to move efficiently. At first, both partners resisted, but as obstacles forced mistakes, they began to follow his method. Step by step, they moved the object through the course, avoiding hazards that had caused other teams to fail. By the end, their group had completed the task with remarkable efficiency. Observers whispered. Humans were being discussed not as weak, but as strategic and reliable. The princess's choice was no longer a surprise, it was becoming a lesson. Leaders from older civilizations began to recognize that human adaptability could not be measured by the same standards as their own species. Elias, despite his modesty, felt a quiet satisfaction. He had survived and led, not through force, but through careful thought, observation, and cooperation. As the day ended, champions were given a moment to rest. Elias wandered the arena quietly, thinking about what lay ahead. The final part of the trial would test courage and moral judgment more than any physical skill. He did not know the exact nature of the challenge, only that it would be designed to reveal character. He felt a sense of calm determination. The galaxy was watching, the princess had chosen him, and he intended to honor that choice. Princess Solaris visited him in the quiet quarters that evening. She found him adjusting his equipment with the same meticulous care he had shown all week. "You have done well," she said. "But the next stage will challenge more than your hands and feet. It will challenge your heart and mind." Elias looked at her, steadying his breath. "I will try to do what is right," he said. "That is enough," she replied. "You do not need to be the strongest, only the one who endures and acts wisely. That is the human way, and it is exactly what the galaxy will need to see." The night passed quietly, but the tension in the arena was palpable. Champions from across the galaxy whispered about the human who had survived the impossible so far. Some plotted ways to outdo him, others watched, intrigued and wary. Elias could not control the opinions of others, only his own actions. He spent hours preparing, checking equipment, and reviewing strategies in his mind. He trained not for victory in the traditional sense, but to remain alive, adaptable, and focused. The following morning, the arena opened to a new environment. A dense forest with shifting terrain, hidden hazards, and complex navigation challenges. This was the final section before the ultimate test. Champions had to navigate, retrieve items, and protect the symbolic object representing the princess's safety. It was designed to reveal instinct, intelligence, and moral choice under pressure. Elias moved carefully, observing the terrain and anticipating hazards. He noticed patterns in the movement of creatures simulated by the arena and used shadows and light to guide his path. When another champion became trapped or injured in the simulated environment, Elias paused to assist, balancing the need to continue with the instinct to help. The other champions moved quickly, sometimes ignoring opportunities to save a competitor in their rush to finish. Step by step, the human advanced through the forest. The weight of the symbolic object never slowed him. His careful movements minimized mistakes. The observers noted his unusual style, not the fastest, not the strongest, but methodical, reliable, and compassionate. Reports spread quickly across the galaxy. Humans, once considered a minor species, were being described as clever and resilient. By midday, the champions reached the central platform of the forest section. Many were exhausted, some failing to complete the tasks. Elias arrived calmly, having helped several companions along the way. He placed the object down, checked on those around him, and waited for the results. The princess watched, her expression unreadable. The judges announced the results. Elias had completed the forest challenge with minimal errors and without failing to assist others. Many stronger champions had fallen behind. Analysts across the Concord debated what this meant. Some suggested the human might be the first outsider in centuries to excel not through strength, but through adaptability and intelligence. Others remained skeptical. Elias realized that the trial had already achieved something unexpected. It had forced the galaxy to reconsider the human species. They were no longer simply a young and untested civilization. They were capable, resourceful, and courageous. And they had proven that survival and success could come from patience, observation, and empathy as much as from muscle or exotic abilities. As the day ended, Elias walked through the quiet corridors of the arena. He thought about the princess, about the faith she had placed in him, and about the challenges yet to come. The final test would demand even more: courage, loyalty, and the ability to make moral choices under extreme pressure. Elias felt a quiet determination. He had survived the first two trials. He had proven that a human could endure where others relied on strength. He had shown that careful observation, empathy, and adaptability could win where raw power failed. The galaxy was watching, and Elias knew that the ultimate test would not only define him as a champion, but could redefine what it meant to be human in the wider universe. Princess Solaris visited him one last time before the final trial. "Tomorrow," she said, "you face the greatest challenge. Not all of it can be overcome with skill. Some of it will test what kind of person you are. Remember, human strength is not measured in muscle but in heart and mind. Trust yourself." Elias nodded. He adjusted his harness one final time, feeling the quiet weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He had learned much in the last days: patience, careful observation, and empathy. Now he would need courage and moral clarity. The trials were far from over, but the human champion was ready. The arena quieted as the sun, or its artificial equivalent, rose higher. Champions prepared themselves for the final day of challenges. The galaxy waited with bated breath, curious to see whether the princess's choice, the human named Elias Ward, would prove to be a symbol of resilience, ingenuity, and unexpected power. Step by careful step, the human walked forward, ready to face whatever lay ahead. The arena transformed into a complex of rooms and platforms. In the center sat a device that looked like an altar of old worlds, a ring of metal and light that hummed with stored power. Around it were scattered replicas of safety objects from the earlier trials. The rules were simple in description and cruel in implication. Each champion would be isolated and given a choice in private. The choices would differ. Some had to choose whether to sacrifice a part of their result for a personal advantage. Others would be given a path that required harming another champion to secure their own win. The judges said the test was meant to measure a champion's willingness to put duty above self. Elias felt his mouth go dry when the arena quieted and the chambers sealed. Something in him tightened. He had expected danger. He had not expected betrayal dressed like duty. He remembered Solaris's voice, her quiet faith. He thought of the faces of those he had helped and those who had helped him. He thought of his sister's message, the seed the Vesh man had given him, the small things that had kept him human in a hall of great powers. When his chamber sealed and the lights dimmed, a soft voice explained his choice. A screen lit with images, a simulated threat to the princess on a distant platform, and a secondary alarm showing that, if he acted to save her, Another chamber would shut down, and one rival champion would fail. The screen asked him to accept that outcome, save the princess and condemn another, or refuse and risk losing both. The logic was cold. The offered reward was clear: immediate elevation, public praise, victory in the trials. The offered cost was the life of a fellow competitor, or at least their immediate elimination. His first reaction was anger. The conquered had dressed its test in the language of duty, but had turned it into a trap that forced people to betray what the trials should stand for. He thought of the many moments where he had reached to pull someone up, to share a rope, to tie a knot that would not fail. He thought of the way people from different worlds had trusted each other in small things. He felt the weight of the princess's chain at his chest like a warm stone. Elias could have reasoned that the games of the conquered had always carried harsh tests. He could have told himself that this was the cost of power, the price of being a figure who would make hard calls. But the choice offered was not about judgment. It was about being made a weapon of manipulation. He felt a deep refusal tighten inside him. He would not play their game the way they thought to play it. He closed his eyes and breathed. He thought of patterns again, the rhythm of shifting platforms, the predictable gusts of wind, the way light reflected on tilted stone. The arena's creators had designed the choice to cage instinct and reward cold calculation. He would respond in the human way that had served him, by refusing to accept a binary that forced one life against another. When he opened his eyes, he made a different choice. He refused to trigger the mechanism by which the judges would declare one eliminated and another saved. Instead, he sent a message through the chamber's panel, not to the judges, but to the arena's public feed. He had learned the basic code of the arena from technicians and trainees. He took the risk of broadcasting his voice live across every feed the conquered used. "People of the conquered," he said, his voice steady and clear, "this test is not honor, it is a trick. They ask us to betray those beside us and call it duty. We are better than that." The broadcast stopped some commentators in mid-sentence. Screens that had carried staged analysis now showed a human's face speaking directly. The rawness of his words carried into homes and councils beyond the dome. Observers were quick and many. Some in the halls shouted for the feed to be cut. Others leaned forward with a new hunger, to see how the trial responded when the player refused the rules. Judges in robes exchanged looks that were not calm. There was, for a moment, confusion as procedure met defiance. From other chambers, noises began. A chant rose, a hesitance, then a voice, then multiple voices repeating his words. Some champions refused the tests offered to them. A few of those faced direct temptations to choose personal triumph over others. Several of those champions locked their own panels or sent their own public messages. The arena pulsed with a sudden chorus of refusal. Not everyone resisted. A handful of champions, hardened by long histories of survival where sacrifice had been real and necessary, took the offered choices and acted. They were fast to judge those who refused as naive. The crowd could not agree. Some shouted for adherence to the rules. Others called for mercy. Celaris's image blinked on a private channel to Elia's mid-broadcast. Her eyes were wide but calm. She had expected friction and had not imagined the judges would craft the final trial so cruelly, but she did not condemn his choice. She sent a simple order to the public channel as well: "Stop the test. This is not honor." Her voice cut through the noise like a clean bell. The judges replied with formal language about tradition and authority. They said the trials could not be stopped for one champion's speech. They invoked history, ancient codes, the sanctity of the right. Some members in the galleries rose in anger, demanding that procedure hold. But now that Elia's voice had been heard and the princess had spoken against the trial, the public reaction changed. On distant worlds, people who had followed the conquered's rituals with polite acceptance felt a disquiet. Those who had always seen the Conquered as a cage smelled the lack of justice in the last test and rallied online. Streams filled with messages calling the trial a setup, a way for the Conquered to claim the loyalty of those its leaders could control. In the dome, tension rose like a storm. A judge moved to cut the broadcast, but the arena's systems were designed with redundancy and public transparency after old scandals. Even the judges could not shut down every channel instantly. The wider audience had seen the test and the Prince of the Conquered's defiance. Petitions that had been private reached public channels. The feeds filled with calls to halt the trial and to examine its design. The Conquered's leaders found themselves facing the very public they had expected to sway with spectacle. Inside the dome, the atmosphere split. Some delegates declared the trial compromised. They called for a pause and an inquiry. Others pushed that process would mean weakness, and that the rite must be completed as tradition demanded. In a rare moment of openness, several champions who had been pushed to choose regretfully opened their panels and refused the verdict. They said the trial had made them into someone they did not want to be. When the judges saw momentum shifting against them, they tried a procedural maneuver, a last attempt to force a resolution on their terms. That move backfired. Solaris, standing up in her box, declared the Conquered's actions a betrayal of the rite's spirit. She stepped forward and invoked a clause in the charter, an old provision granting the sovereign the right to call for a pause when public order was at stake. Her voice did not shake. She had chosen Elias, and now she chose to stand publicly with his defiance. Her action did something the judges had not counted on. It made their attempt to force the trial appear nakedly political. The public outcry accelerated. Delegations aligned with the judges found themselves isolated by commentators who asked hard questions. For whom did the Conquered really serve? The dome hummed with new energy, and Elias felt his heart pound with a mixture of fear and hope. When the lights dimmed and the chamber panels slid open, the judges could hardly maintain the pretense of neutrality. They announced an immediate inquiry. The trials were suspended. The Conquered's archive opened to a public review. The hall that had once seemed older than the stars now felt exposed and human-sized. People across the galaxy poured questions into the channels. They demanded reform and fairness. In the days that followed, the Conquered faced public hearings. Old secrets and small corruptions were not all revealed at once, but the tone had changed. The galaxy had watched a human refuse a simple command, and the ripple grew into a wave. Solaris supported transparency. She asked for representatives from a dozen worlds, including Earth, to sit on a reform committee. Elias was offered a choice: to return to Earth and be celebrated, or to remain a living voice on the committee to help set the new course. He chose to stay. His decision surprised many. Some had expected him to return home to quiet comforts. He had new reasons. The people he had come to know in the hall had become friends. The Vakar who had once sneered now spoke with him about craft and loyalty. The Zephyra who had once panicked now sought his counsel. The change he had helped start felt fragile, and he wished to be part of what came next. The reforms that followed were not instant or perfect. There were fierce debates. Some factions resisted changes that reduced their power. Others pushed for speed and radical overhaul. Millions of voices argued on public channels. In the end, the Conquered did not collapse, but it changed. The right of champions survived in a new form. The tests became less about spectacle and more about service. Judges were required to publish their rules and to justify their designs before a review board. Champions would be trained across disciplines and not chosen solely by birth. The galaxy had learned it could be held to account. Elias and Solaris worked together, sitting in rooms that had once witnessed grand speeches and now heard the patient work of drafting new rules. They spent long hours talking about what a champion should be. Someone who could lead, yes, but also someone who could refuse orders that were unjust. The princess's choice had been more than a political shock. It had shown many that power could be used to protect others rather than to reinforce old fears. For Earth and for humans, the change meant a new place in the conversations of the galaxy. Delegates began to visit Earth more often, not to judge it but to learn from it. People on Earth watched a human who had been small in a great hall return with new ideas and a firmer voice. Elias kept a seed the Vesh man had once given him. He planted it in a small pot and watched it curl like thin fingers toward light. It felt like a private reminder that small things could grow. When the ceremonies ended and new rules were only just taking hold, there were celebrations in many systems. Celaris and Elias walked once more into the Concord's dome, but the atmosphere had shifted. The crowd now included citizens who once would not have been invited. They looked at Elias not as curiosity, but as a person who had chosen a difficult and honest path. He wore the princess's chain still, but now it felt less like a weight and more like a promise he had kept. In the quiet between speeches, Elias thought of home. He thought of his sister's two-line message and the smell of warm tea. He had not sought glory. He had wanted only to do what felt right. Now the galaxy was changing, not because one great power decided, but because many small voices found courage together. That was a lesson he felt would last. Before he returned to Earth many months later, he stood on the Concord's highest balcony and watched the stars. The galaxy was still full of old dangers and proud governments, but there was also a new thread running through its politics, a recognition that a champion was not simply the strongest, but the most humane. He had learned that the human way, stubborn, careful, creative, and kind, could be a power large enough to shift systems. He smiled at the thought and tucked the seed into his pocket. When the ship that would carry him home left the Concord's orbit, the feeds recorded his farewell. He did not make a long speech. He said only what came from a place he knew to be true. Keep watching, keep asking, and remember to help those beside you. The cameras captured his voice and then turned to wider things. On many worlds people repeated his words, not because he was famous, but because they had felt right to them. The princess chose a human as her champion. The galaxy gasped.